So this morning we continue our discussion about kings and prophets and their
Yep.
are influencing me. One is by Walter Brueggemann, both of them. This one's called David's Truth. And this was actually delivered as a series of lectures at our seminary. Matthew and I went to the same seminary, Austin Seminary, and this was delivered in the 1980s. And he dedicates it, he thanks Austin Seminary, etc. And another book he wrote later on called David and His Theologians, a little more technical, but both these books are terrific. I've learned an awful lot from them. And so I'm going to use them this morning as we think about David. David, oh my. David's story is told and retold throughout the Hebrew scriptures, and then the tale is continued in the New Testament. So some scholars would say that the two most important figures in the whole Hebrew story are Moses, who we talked about last week, and David, who we'll talk about more this week. And what's interesting about the story of David and Moses is that Moses' ministry and life is recorded over 40-something years, 40-plus years. And David's life and story is told over 40-plus years. It's told that he becomes king in Hebron at age 33, and he rules there for 7 years, and then he rules another 33 years in Jerusalem. So if you're doing the math, he is king of Israel for 40 years. And we even get the story of David when he's younger. So David's story, like Moses, encompasses over 40 years. And so one of the things that we'll see in the story of David are his grandeur and his deep flaws. And that's what makes David so accessible in so many ways. Just like Moses, his grandeur and his deep flaws are both told. In other words, warts and all. You get the whole story of David. And his grandeur, though, will finally be the most important one. Now, one of the questions we have to raise about this David story is, who's telling it? How did they get this information? Where did it come from? Well, Brueggemann suggests that there are kind of four different angles at which David is presented. And this would remind you, of course, of the four Gospels, right? The four different ways that Jesus is presented. The same thing happens here. So if you doing your chapter and verse sort of thing, 1 Samuel 16 through 2 Samuel 5:5 is the first telling of David. That's the story of the young kid who ends up becoming the king of Israel. Surprise, surprise, right? Then 2 Samuel 5:6 through 8:18 is the prophet Nathan, who's going to legitimize David's rule, that he's not just a usurper to the throne, that he's God's chosen. We'll talk about that more in a moment. Then the third version of David is in 2 Samuel 8 through 20, and then it continues on in 1st and 2nd Kings, the first two chapters of 1st Kings. And that's called sometimes the painful truth about David. It's also sometimes called the succession narrative, answering the question, who will reign after David dies? And the answer to that question is Solomon. Then the last version of David is told in the Chronicles and also in some Psalms. First Chronicles 10 through 29 retells the story of David, but here's a big exception. Chronicles sanitizes David. David does not have an affair with Bathsheba. And that's left out entirely in the First Chronicles rendering of the story of David. It should remind you, those of you who've been to presidential libraries. I've been to presidential libraries, about 5 of them. And they sort of sanitize those pictures, don't they, a little bit? They sort of clean up those presidents. Think of First Chronicles as a presidential library. Now, last week we talked about David struggling with Saul. Well, at the end of 1 Samuel, as you recall, 31st chapter, both Saul and Jonathan are killed. And so the story continues on in 2 Samuel, the first chapter, when David gets word of what has happened to his dear and beloved friend, Jonathan. and his opponent for so long, Saul. And what happens is David tears his clothes ceremonially, and he laments and he writes a beautiful psalm about how the mighty have fallen and how his heart is broken because of the bloodshed that brought down Saul and his beloved son, Jonathan. So that story that ends the Saul story begins the David story in a brand new way. Now he has sort of a direct line to the throne, but it doesn't come easy. And if you read 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, you'll realize that the first thing that happens to David after the death of Saul is that David is engaged in a warfare with one of Saul's sons. And that son is Ishbosheth. Well, I'm not going to go into all the gory details, but basically what happens is Ishbosheth is murdered and his general Abner is murdered, and David has to publicly show that his hands are free of their blood, that he is innocent of their death. And he makes a big public show of that. Well, the result of this is that in 2 Samuel 5, all the tribes of Israel from the north and the south come to Hebron, which is south of Jerusalem, and there they publicly anoint David yet again as the king of a united kingdom. Now, when they told this story about David, probably they knew that the kingdom was already divided. So they look back to that crowning in Hebron as the good old days. The good old days when the north and the south were united together. And so David now is crowned the king of a united kingdom, and it all looks wonderful. So the second telling of David starts in 2 Samuel 5, and it goes through the 8th chapter. Here, the question is David just a usurper to the throne, that is, had Saul knocked off, etc., and then Ishbosheth, or is he the Lord's anointed? So in this section of 2 Samuel, the answer is given like this. David has all these huge military victories. Things are going beautifully for him. And then Nathan has a dream. Nathan is a prophet. And Nathan's dream tells him that he, Nathan, is to go to David and to anoint him and to reassure him his dynasty will live forever. So you get this magnificent experience for David where Nathan comes to him and says, God is going to build a house for you. Not necessarily that you're going to build a house for God. That'll be Solomon's task. But God is going to build your house, because the same word is used for house and dynasty in Hebrew. And God says, God will build you a house, and it will be an eternal dynasty that will never end. Well, as Brueggemann says in his marvelous book, this is the highest royal theology in the entire Hebrew scriptures. You can read this in 2 Samuel, the 7th chapter. It's a very important text. It's reused again and again in the New Testament to refer to that other son of David who will reign forever and ever. Amen. So in 2 Samuel 7, David is told by Nathan, yours is going to be a royal dynasty like no other. And the response to David's good news is he offers a prayer, and the prayer of thanksgiving ends up being like this. Who am I to be the king of Israel? I'm a poor servant. I was taken from the fields shepherding the flocks. I was just a young kid. Who am I? And so David in this prayer recognizes that he is deeply blessed by God to be in the position that he is. And 2 Samuel 8 shows you what happens when you're blessed by God. Guess what? You have more military victories. And David is sitting pretty. So at the end of 2 Samuel 8, one of the questions you have to start raising for yourself is this. Oh boy, will success spoil Rock Hunter? Will David's success go to his head? And apparently so. So we get to 2 Samuel 9 through 20, and here we get what Brueggemann calls the painful truth about David. The painful truth. Whereas everything previous to this, David had been pictured more or less from the outside. It was almost like a journalist taking a look at this meteoric rise in this young man, from Bethlehem to become king of Israel. And it's all told more or less from the outside perspective of David. Then it shifts. From this point on, the narrative looks into the interior life of David. And we now get an inner look at David's motivations, his private life. You might, Brueggemann calls these the David tapes. And it's almost like you have to ask the question, where did this narrator get this information about the interior life of David? I'm almost imagining David late in life calling in David Frost, to give a series of interviews with him, like Nixon did, and sort of divulging, well, oh boy, that was that then, but that's now. And so somehow the narrative shifts here, and you're going to look inside the soul of this incredibly successful king who, by the way, has everything going for him. He has more military victories. He has shown kindness to Mephibosheth, who is Jonathan's disabled son. So the text begins here so positive about David until we get to fateful chapter 11. Now remember, David has multiple wives. He has multiple children. He has God's blessing. He has the love of the people. He has military victories. He's got it all until late one afternoon. And the text says David was bored. No, it actually doesn't say that. But let's imagine it says late one afternoon in the spring when kings go to war, David's not at the front. He's on top of his roof and he's bored. And what does he see? Oh my, beautiful Bathsheba in all of her glory. She's taking a bath, and David is just bowled over. And David, like some people of power, does something because he can. And what he does is he summons Bathsheba to the palace. Now, Bathsheba's married. She's married to a foreigner, probably a mercenary in David's army, named Uriah the Hittite. And Uriah the Hittite is with Joab, his main army commander, at the front. And Joab has Uriah under his command. So David sends for Bathsheba, and I guess that the tale doesn't have to be too specific, but they have sex. And not only do they have sex, she gets pregnant. So David is in a peck of trouble. But David, because he can, figures out a plot. And here's the plot. I'm going to bring back Uriah the Hittite from the front lines. And I'm going to ask him to go, have some R&R with his wife, Bathsheba, and that'll cover it, and we'll be done. Well, guess what? Uriah the Hittite is a very loyal soldier, and he knows the rules of holy warfare. And the rules of holy warfare are this: when you're engaged in combat, you do not have sex. You're sort of engaged totally for the Lord. And there's no sexual playing around when you're a soldier of the Lord. And Uriah refuses to do that. And then David tries to get him drunk. And so then, oh, Uriah, long night. It's okay. Go ahead and go home now that you're here. And he doesn't do it. He sleeps on the front of David's palace with the palace guard. And so David said, what am I going to do with this loyal, obedient Hittite warrior that I've employed? He won't go home to have sex. Well, okay, I'll send him back to the army, but I'm going to send with him a letter. And in that letter, it's going to be, Dear General Joab, when the fighting gets fierce, send Uriah the Hittite into the deepest, darkest, most difficult warfare you can imagine. And then draw the troops back and let him have it. Well, Uriah the Hittite obediently gives that letter to Joab, which is his death sentence. And sure enough, it happens just as David anticipated. And then to make matters worse, when David gets word that that's what happened to Uriah the Hittite, you know what he says? It is what it is. This is war. You know, things happen. Don't you know? So it looks like David has gotten himself out of a pickle, right? And then along comes Nathan the prophet, 2 Samuel 12. And Nathan says, Dear King, I have something I need to say to you. But I need to tell you that something terrible happened, and I want to tell you a parable. And the parable goes like this. There was a rich man who had many, many flocks. And next door to him was a poor man who had one sheep. And one time the rich man had some visitors to come to see him. And instead of taking some lambs out of his own flock, he takes the sole lamb, the one lamb that his poor neighbor had, and he uses that and butchers that to provide a feast for his friend. And David is incensed. How could someone be so evil to do such a thing? And Nathan looks at him, and in Hebrew, he says, Hata ha'ish. You are the man. You are the man. And immediately, David gets it. This is the grandeur of David and the flaws of David, all wrapped in one brilliant moment. And then Nathan says something to him that will be the theme of the rest of our David story. And here's what he says. David, from this time forward, the sword will never leave your family. And sex will be a problem in your family. I'm summarizing what he says. But basically, David, what you did in private will now become the public consequence of what you have done. And David knows immediately that he has done wrong. And he says, Lord, I have sinned. It's interesting the text doesn't say initially, I sinned against Uriah and I sinned against Bathsheba. It basically starts like this. I have sinned against you, O Lord. And the immediate consequences of David's action go like this. 2 children. One is born to Bathsheba, and that son dies. And David had been praying and praying, and when he gets word that the child dies, he goes and cleans up his face and goes out and meets the public, so to speak. And then, curiously, I think this is the most curious part of this whole story, there's another son involved. Because after this, David, who has killed Uriah the Hittite and had adultery with Bathsheba, guess what? He becomes her husband. And she is brought into the palace, and guess what? They have a son, and that son's name is Solomon. So one son dies and one son's born. And that is the immediate consequence of what David did. But then the story takes on a life of its own, because now David is going to see played out before him all of his private sins are going to be writ large. They're going to now be on the public screen for everyone to see. Y'all seen those commercials now where you talk about your identity being exposed and you're walking down the street and your social security card is up on a plaque, etc. This is what the succession narrative is about. David's private life now becomes eminently public. And it starts with several of his children. One is Amnon and other is Absalom, and they're half brothers. They have different mothers, but the same father, and Tamar. So these are half brothers and half sisters, and I'm going to make a real gory story kind of short. Let's look at it this way. Amnon tricks Tamar to come help him because he's sick. While he's in bed, he grabs her and rapes her. And then he hates her. He hates her. And my dear friend Lane Leckman explained that to me last week. So now I know a psychiatrist's answer to this. You project onto the object of your conquest all of your self-loathing. Right, Lane? We'll get back with you on that. And Tamar complains to Absalom, her half-brother, and it turns out that now Absalom will kill Amnon in revenge. Okay, so what do we have here? Private sex, public murder. The second episode involves that same young man, Absalom, who is perhaps the finest looking young man in the whole kingdom, who loves to wear his hair long and only cuts it once a year. So the text says that when it's cut at the end of a long year of growth, it weighs 5 pounds. Now, this is a gorgeous dude, and it turns out David is shown to be a terrible father because Absalom is trying to undermine David, and yet David simply can't figure out what to do. Eventually, Absalom is expelled because of this murder of Amnon. But then David, what were you thinking? He lets Absalom come back home. And when Absalom gets back into Jerusalem, guess what he does? He starts bringing all these people into his orbit, and he's good looking and he's forceful in his language and he makes good decisions for people. And they think, boy, that David he's kind of getting old now. Let's move toward a younger version of David. And Absalom looks like the guy. Well, in one of the most poignant parts of the whole David story, David gets run out of town by Absalom's forces. And he, by the way, those of you who are interested in biblical geography, he goes out the east gate of Jerusalem and in a way retraces the steps of Jesus' triumphant entry coming in from Bethany down the Kidron Valley up into the east gate of Jerusalem. David goes out that gate and down that valley out the same way that Jesus would come in. And all the while he's lamenting and putting dust on his head, and people are even throwing rocks at him and cursing him to his face, etc. It is the true low point in David's life. And guess what happens back in Jerusalem once David's out of the way? David had set in charge of the palace, his kingly palace, 10 concubines. Okay, I don't understand, but nevertheless, 10 concubines are set in place. And so Absalom goes to the palace and he says, what can I do to show publicly that I'm in charge here and that David is my enemy? Oh, okay, I got an idea. Let's put a tent up in the public part of the palace. By the way, probably the very place on the palace roof where David was walking that late one afternoon, and saw Bathsheba. They put up a little tent, and Absalom, in front of God and everybody in Jerusalem, has sex with all 10 concubines. Now you're thinking, what does that mean? That means David's the king, and he can do whatever he wants to. So what David did privately, another opening, another show. It's completely and totally public. So Absalom now has shamed David. Oh, so David finally will go to war with Absalom. And in the war with Absalom, he tells his troops, Joab is still around. He says, look, go ahead and kill all of Absalom's followers, but don't you dare kill Absalom. And his troops are going, what? He's after your life. So eventually what happens is, as a matter of fact, remember Absalom's beautiful long hair? It gets caught in a tree. And he's hanging there between heaven and earth, swinging from his hair. And Joab's troops come upon him and fill him full of arrows. And he dies. And so the word comes back to David. He gets word, what happened? What happened to Absalom? And finally they tell him, King David, your son's dead. We killed him. And what does David do? He laments publicly, Absalom, Absalom, my son Absalom, oh, that I would have died and that you would have lived. And Joab gets word of what David has done. And he comes to him and he says, you sent all these troops out there to risk their lives to save your skin. And now you're lamenting that your son who led that revolt is dead at our hands, and you care more about your dead son than all these troops who gave their life for you. You should be ashamed. By the way, does Joab sound a little bit like Nathan? Yeah. And David, just like when he heard Nathan, realized Joab is so right. And so David washes his face, puts on good clothes, goes out and thanks the troops. That's the flaws and the grandeur of David just brought back together beautifully. So at the end of this tale, David now goes back to Jerusalem. He's reestablished in the kingship. There are other rebellions, by the way, I don't have time to tell you about, but David ultimately is secure in his throne. Now, again, let me quickly tell you, that whole complex of stories I just told you about David, Bathsheba, and the consequences, not a word of that, not a word of it is found in First Chronicles, in the retelling of the David story. Again, the sanitized David. Well, ultimately, you need to know one more tale, and then we'll talk about this. In 2 Samuel 24, there is a very curious story. And it goes like this. God was angry at David, so he incited him or inspired him to take a census of the whole country to know how many troops would be at his disposal. By the way, the census here is different from ours. For ours, it's talking about allocation of resources. For David, the census was, how many troops will I have to manage when we go to war? Now, what's wrong with a census? Because it violates the rules of holy war. Remember, I told you earlier about Uriah the Hittite did not violate the rules of holy war. This is a violation of the rules of holy war, because holy war, you depend upon God raising up the army, not having some administrative numbers at your disposal. So that's what that's about. Well, after David does this, his conscience starts to eat at him, and he realizes he's done something wrong. This is the greatness of David. He realizes immediately that he's done wrong. And then a new prophet, whose name is Gad, G-A-D, comes to David and said, David, you did wrong on the census, and you're going to have consequences, but I'm going to give you, three choices. Now, again, think of 3 choices for my consequences of my sin, okay? And Gad says, here are your 3 doors to choose from. First of all, you could have, let's see here, 3 years of famine, okay? Or how about this? 3 months on the run from your enemies. Now, David had already done that with Absalom before, right? Or how about this last door? You will have 3 days of plague. So here are your choices: 3 years of famine, 3 months of being on the run, or 3 days of plague. And David's answer is, I would rather deal with the Lord, who might be merciful. So I'll take door number 3. I'll go with 3 days of plague. And the text says, strangely enough, 70,000 Israelites die in 3 days. That's even more than our plague. And at the end, the angel of death is approaching where? Jerusalem. Jerusalem, David's home turf. And David prays, oh God, don't take Jerusalem. Take me, take me. And then David sees, are you ready for this? An angel of the Lord in a threshing floor. And the angel of the Lord, David pleads, don't kill my people. And guess what? David was right. Go with the 3 days, because God's mercy might triumph over judgment. And it does. And the angel stops delivering death and does not touch Jerusalem. And so at the very end, David buys this threshing floor. It's kind of a barn from the guy who owned it. And there he builds an altar. And on that altar, he sacrifices all kinds of animals, in effect, pleading for God to end the plague. And it does. That plague ends at that point. That's how 2 Samuel ends. David, as a one who's encountered God's angel directly, offers sacrifices, and then the plague ends. Okay. So in looking at this story, one of the things I just want to stress again is that no 2 figures dominate the Hebrew scriptures like Moses and David. Their tale is told for 40 years, warts and all. But in those warts, there is that capacity to repent and to realize that you're wrong. And that shows the grandeur of both Moses and David. And so in the First Chronicles telling, by the way, of David, the point is this: the exilic community, the post-exilic community comes back, and their city of David has been destroyed, their temple's been destroyed, their kingship's been destroyed, and they look back on the good old days of David. And what do? They yearn and they hope for a new David, some new king that will have a heart like David, who with all of his flaws at least had this capacity to repent and change and become obedient to God. So that's why the early Christians were willing to talk about Jesus as a new David, someone that Israel had yearned for ever since the exile. So that's a little bit of the story of David, and I bet you've got questions and observations. But here's I guess the question I would pose to y'all, and I'd be interested in your reactions to this. How does God put up with such flawed people? I mean, Moses has plenty of flaws. By the way, Moses and David have one thing in common. They're both murderers. They're both murderers. So how is it that God is willing to use these flawed critters to become such critical leaders? Moses at the beginning of Israel's life, and David kind of in this central moment 1,000 years before Jesus. What's going on here? Is God that merciful? Huh.